We begin today's service with these words from the Global Chalice Lighting Program, sponsored by the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists. We are gathered here and now. For a moment, we've stopped working, studying, doing dishes. There are no tasks, no emails, no phone calls. We are gathered to feel closer to each other, to feel closer to ourselves, to feel closer to our deepest inspiration, the stream of life that runs through our body and runs through the world. May we be opened to see and hear in each other what our soul wants to say.
Hi, I'm Judy Bonner, facilitator of your newly formed Racial Allies for Racial Justice team, which is a sub-team of SJOT. We are proud to be presenting a virtual racial justice workshop on 3 Mondays in November, the 9th, 23rd, and 30th, from 6:30 to 8 p.m. The presenters need no introduction to most of you, Reverend Michael Carter and Reverend Judith Long. Some of you may remember a workshop they presented a few years ago. This new one promises to be timely, relevant, and challenging. In session 1, we will discuss the difference between diversity training and anti-racism efforts for institutions. In session 2, white privilege and white fragility will be explored. And in session 3, we will learn how to become an ally in the struggle for racial justice. Each session will include a presentation and a discussion in small breakout groups. Mark your calendars. This is a conversation we all need to have. To join this powerful workshop, please send your name and email address to judybonner1@outlook.com with workshop in the subject line. We will reserve your space and send you a reminder and the Zoom link before each session. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Don Rollins talking to you from the Unitarian Universalist congregation here in Hendersonville, North Carolina. Meg let you know a little bit more about us, so I'll skip that part. If you haven't been with us before, my name is Don Rollins, and I serve the congregation as its accredited interim minister. Today I want to take us into deep waters. I want to talk about evil. And those of you who don't know much about us, one of the great gifts of this way of life, this religion, this way of religion, is that we are free to develop as we go over time. So this morning I'm going to talk to you about something where I'm going to kind of buck the tide of some of the thinking in my denomination, and ask for you to start thinking about your own responses to the word evil, and we can talk about that further whenever we meet at 11:30 a.m. on Sunday morning. But in the meantime, just try to ruminate about that. And from my end, when I talk about evil, kind of heady here, but for me, it's the illegitimate usurpation of power. By that I mean taking away somebody else's power. So with that in mind, let me talk to you about evil. And a little bit more heads up, it's going to go a little bit longer than usual. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I came to Unitarian Universalism in 1984, the same year the 7 principles and purposes, and 6 purposes, the official statement of commonly held values among Unitarian Universalists, gained final bylaw status. For my part, I was a flat broke, mostly Methodist seminary student, positively elated to land a decent paying job as an interim religious educator at First UU, Columbus, Ohio, even if I had barely a clue about my new employer. As to the 7 principles, they were as green as I. For at least a decade prior, our association's leadership had been hard at work, taking the theological and relational temperature of a movement clearly more confederation than denomination. They had for decades sensed a craving among our congregations for a common language to describe and identify our common values. And there was general rejoicing when the 7 principles were adopted. That craving was best described in 1971 by then UUA President Eugene Pickett, as he connected the lack of denominational clarity with our shrinking numbers. He wrote, "The malaise lies in our confusion as to what word we have to spread. The old watchwords of liberalism, freedom, reason, tolerance, worthy though they may be, they are simply not catching the imagination of the contemporary world. They describe a process for approaching the religious depths, but they testify to no intimate acquaintance with the depths themselves. If we are ever to speak to a new age, we must supplement our seeking with some profound religious truths." In the 14 years between Pickett's observation and final adoption of the principles, there were many fits and starts, some of the fits having to do with language, of course, but also the more serious matter of how central a role the principles should play in the free church tradition. Now, it's worth noting that dissension over the principles was real but minimal. In a 2000 article from the UU World, our main publication, contributing editor Warren Ross made passing reference to the dissenters. He wrote, "All this agreement, it hardly needs adding, does cause some unhappiness among those who, while acknowledging the principles are not a creed in the dictionary sense, still see a common statement of belief that comes uncomfortably close to creedalism." But in the end, Ross observed the desire for some verbal formula about which all, or at least most of us, can say, yes, that's what I more or less believe. The desire for that creed far and away trumped any concerns about creedalism. And so it was the principles and I came to Unitarian Universalist a mere 2 months apart. Well, I wended my way around this new faith tradition. Not that many of us use the word faith in that era. I was surprised to find myself increasingly, if somewhat secretly, aligned with the principles naysayers. But I was a UU newbie. Give it time. In hindsight, what I shared with that crotchety crowd was the nagging doubt about so broad a statement of belief. Even though the preamble clearly states the principles were intended to be a covenant between congregations, not individuals, people being people, could a movement so hungry for theological clarity resist making the 7 principles a theological litmus test for being a real UU? The faculty of the Methodist Theological School, that's Delaware, Ohio, of the mid-1980s was rife with religious liberals, none of whom were Unitarian Universalists, all of whom had something to teach me, from the open-minded Carmelite nun to the recovering alcoholic Episcopalian rector, to the humble Dominican priest who spent his Sunday mornings doing street ministry and cleaning up sidewalk vomit, left there by dope-sick folks ravaged by addiction. These were my teachers. And looking back, I had the best of both worlds, my philosophical UU mentors, and my if it doesn't work in the ghetto, it's not worth the time professors. But there were also fundamental tensions between the two, none more stark than human nature, and by association, the problem of evil. The UUs were, and for me are, far too sunny for life as I'd seen it and experienced it. And I tell you all this because while I was getting my head around the principles in general, the real disconnect had to do with the first, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I could not square those UU assertions with the damage we humans do to one another and the planet that sustains us. And meanwhile, back at the seminary, my teachers were at ease talking about sin, not the kind rooted in the monstrous myth of a cursed and a fallen race, face down and prostrate before a fickle, emotionally unstable parent. Rather, sin was code for our ever-present, universal capacity to inflict suffering and take away another's power. Seen through the collective eyes of my profs, evil occurs the moment we wrongly hear the value judgment, we wrongly use our power to strip away somebody else's. And here, evil is located in persons, not childish projections of a dark and fallen angel. Worth and dignity in my seminary mentor's aggregate worldview does not automatically come with being human. It comes with being, and here another value judgment, being a worthy, if imperfect, steward of the humanity and the divinity that we are given. To put it yet another way, worth and dignity come as the results of our contribution to the common good. And evil, then, is putting ourselves ahead of the whole. This description of evil, it fit the worldview that I knew, the one in which human cruelty is forever one threat, one fist, and yes, one mindless border wall away. And to keep this real, as singer-songwriter Nick Lowe wrote, this way of looking at sin addressed the beast in me, not the one I sometimes project onto others, the one that dwells within, the one that comes with being human. But back at the UU Church, circa 1984, sin was not in our lexicon. To tell a truth, the very word evoked sarcasm, even criticism. My new denomination was quickly embracing automatic worth and dignity as its central tenet. So I did my best to join ranks. My response to the growing first principle culture of Unitarian Universalism was to take a stealth approach and hope nobody noticed my lack of references to the principles. But over time, I began to realize I was not alone. More and more UUs, some of them my colleagues in ministry, were voicing their own disconnect with the first principle. They were not, I was not, begrudging others their truth. We weren't positing a reverse doctrine, claiming human beings are innately evil. Rather, we were asking questions not widely posed in our precious tribe. What is the real world baseline for assigning automatic human worth and dignity? We can trace that throughout our history, yes, but for real, where does it come from? The automatic worth and dignity. Another question. By what authority was our denomination staking out one of the boldest theological, philosophical claims ever? The dissenters' answers were there exists in the human heart and across history the capacity to inflict suffering so heinous that value judgment claims for worth and dignity betray the scope of that suffering. This conviction was not well received in some places. Those who deeply considered truth ran counter to the first principle were sometimes labeled un-UU. We had not met the litmus test. But the dissenter and me, we were in good company. In an article that appeared in the November-December 2002 issue of UU World, again, our denominational magazine, parish minister and editor Rosemary Bray McNatt poses the question, and I have mentioned this before in a different sermon, but she posed the question, what if Martin Luther King Jr. had cast his lot with the Unitarian Universalists? In an interview with Coretta Scott King, McNatt was surprised to learn that both Coretta and Martin attended services at Unitarian Universalist churches. Let me back up. With Unitarian churches, because this was pre-merger in 1961. They attended those congregations when they were in Boston. McNatt says she was heartbroken when Coretta told her the couple had at one time considered joining our tradition, but decided they could not, quoting, build a mass movement of Black people if we were Unitarian. But McNatt points out that race wasn't the only barrier between the Kings and our movement. It was also our lack of a theology of evil that was true to the Black experience in America. From that same article, she writes, even if race had disappeared as an issue, King might have found the barrier of theology insurmountable. Though from the very start of his theological training, he showed a bent toward liberal religion, by the time his faith had been tried by the civil rights movement, King had said no to the sunny optimism of liberal faith, an optimism frankly untested in the heat of battle for liberty and dignity for African Americans. In his famous essay, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, published in the Christian Century series, How My Mind Has Changed in 1960, King made those reservations about liberal religion very clear. He wrote, there is one phase of liberalism that I hope to cherish always, its devotion to the search for truth, its refusal to abandon the best light of reason. It was the liberal doctrine that I began to question, the doctrine, and here I'm using the original language, the doctrine of man. The more I observed the tragedies of history, and again, man's shameful inclination to choose the low road, the more I came to see the depths and the strengths of sin. I came to feel that liberalism had been all too sentimental concerning human nature, and that it leaned toward a false idealism. I also came to see that liberalism's superficial optimism concerning human nature caused it to overlook the fact that reason is darkened by sin. Liberalism failed to see that reason itself is a little more than an instrument to justify man's defensive ways of thinking. To that I say, ouch. For King, a theology of evil in which no deed renders the doer beyond ultimate worth and dignity leaves that theology open to charges of what he called superficial optimism. Furthermore, King insisted, such a framework does not bear the weight of history's most despicable figures, groups, and deeds. Thus, holding out for inherent worth and dignity is a luxury reserved for the privileged, for folks one step removed from that kind of evil's full brunt. A quick illustration of King's pragmatic theology of oppression as a form of sin. And here I've used this example before, but it's good. Benjamin Hooks, the King lieutenant, remembers the time someone asked Dr. King if he thought a change in laws would create a change in hearts. And once again, allow me to borrow the sexist language that he used for that period. Dr. King was asked if he thought a change in laws would create a change in hearts. King replied, I'm not particularly concerned about changing men's hearts. I want the right to drink from a water fountain, to use a restroom. I don't care what a man thinks of me as long as I can use that restroom and drink from that fountain. This was the king of his later years. Toughened by a decade of violence, even death, he was focused on institutional transformation and increasingly uninterested in searching his oppressor's soul for goodness. This is the king who faced human sinfulness every day, and I doubt he spent much time reminding himself of Bull Connor's worth and dignity. So the kings could not cast their fate with ours. Now let us turn to one who did and still does. Bill Schultz, former president of our association, former director of Amnesty International, and former president, CEO of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, Schultz has something to offer too. I was in the room at the 2006 General Assembly when Schultz delivered the Berry Street Lecture, the annual address given to UU religious professionals. Schultz's sermon, "What Torture Has Taught Me," was oddly uplifting for those of us in the first principle minority. A marquee figure of our tribe was sharing convictions very much like ours. From that sermon, when we speak of the inherent worth and dignity of every person, I suspect we base our belief in the inherent worth of human beings on some far vaguer notion that aliveness itself is good, and some outdated hierarchical assumption that because human beings, or at least as my addition here, at least we consider them the pinnacle of aliveness, then we possess inherently some kind of merit. He continues, "Well, I don't buy that anymore. I have fought tirelessly against the death penalty in this country. I visited death rows, spoken frequently with condemned prisoners. Some of them have acknowledged their crimes and altered their hearts. Others of them are truly innocent, and many of them are mentally ill. And some of them are vicious, dangerous killers." He continues, "I oppose the death penalty not because I believe that every one of those lives carries inherent worth. In some cases, their death would be no loss at all to anyone. And I oppose the death penalty because I can't be sure which of them falls into which category, and because the use of executions by the state diminishes my own dignity and that of every other citizen in whose name it is enforced. I need, in other words, to assign the occupants of death row worth and dignity in order to preserve my own. But I find no such characteristics inherent in either them or me." I told you we were headed toward deep waters. Schultz is calling for an alternate UU theological universe where dignity is based on one's behavior, mental faculties allowing, by the way. Dignity is based on one's behavior, not the mere reality that we share a species in a moment of time. Be clear, he is not asking us to suspend the rigorous work of living lives of love and reconciliation, our own request for redemption, nor does he overlook the fact that he's replaced one set of value judgments with another. What our former president is saying is we should consider human doing, not being, as the baseline for assigning worth and dignity. So Schultz is not alone in this deviation from the UU norm. Although inherent worth and dignity has deep roots in universalism, there have always been religious liberals that built their beliefs around what they called salvation of character, or deeds over creeds. Indeed, the vast majority of our history was spent without a centralized statement on human nature. But easily, 2/3 of today's Unitarian Universalists have grown up with or come to us with the principles as the basis for being a UU. Some of them, I think, have taken the principles for granted as the definitive source for our shared identity. For many, there can be no separation between their personal beliefs and those personal statements. And I say we should celebrate that. But when I raise the idea that when we divorce personal values with the 7 principles, it's no wonder when I suggest that I might as well don a fluorescent orange jail suit with a sign on the back that says, "I hate small puppies." But now, stay with me. Now that I have outed myself as a first principle doubter, and you're yet to throw books toward the video, I think, let me tell you why. First, as any statement of values, the first principle took shape in a particular context, particular era. It was mostly crafted by, and mostly kept in place by an overall privileged people, a predominantly white denomination that regularly ranks high in per capita income and advanced degrees. This is not a moral condemnation. This profile describes me too. Not a moral condemnation, but honest recognition that evil looks and feels very differently in the barrios and the projects, in the mountainside shacks, than those safe places the majority of us call home. Secondly, and related, whole cultures and subgroups were underrepresented when the first principle was drafted and adopted. Women, people of color, gay folk, non-binary gender persons, poor UUs, all victimized by our systemic discrimination in ways we were yet to discover. So they were not at the table. Which raises the question, does our belief in inherent worth and dignity square with the survivors of all manner of violations and indignities, some of whom sit in our pews, some of whom speak from our pulpits? Thirdly, questioning the first principle is not questioning hope or trust or the quest for deep connections with those different from us. It is not an exercise in nihilism. It in no way discounts the possibility for redemption. Indeed, Schulz's theology of evil is grounded in the human capacity to change. He wrote toward the end of that sermon, "Torture has taught me one more thing. If these 12 years have caused me to rethink the nature of God, the inherency of human worth, and credibility of individual authority, they have more than confirmed 2 other bedrock Unitarian Universalist principles." I never get this word right. The indomitability of the human race, of the human spirit, and the mysterious workings of an unfettered grace. Let me do that again. If these 12 years have caused me to rethink the nature of God, the inherency of human worth and dignity, credibility of individual authority, they have more than confirmed 2 other bedrock Unitarian Universalist principles: the indomitability of the human spirit and the mysterious workings of an unfettered grace. What torture has taught me, what all these brave souls, and yes, even a few other torturers have taught me, is never to give up on the glimmers of grace, for all is not what it seems. And here Schultz gets to the heart of the difference between mainstream UU assumptions and those of us in the minority. First principle dissenters, like first principle believers, look for what is good and just and gracious and, yes, loving. It's just that we dissenters don't always believe we're going to find it. So I celebrate, laying part of a tradition so secure in its truth that even its leaders are entitled to grow and to claim a different truth. In my case, I have changed my primary theology 3 times since I entered the Unitarian Universalist fold. 3 times, and never had to leave, never had to surrender my credentials. So this tradition has comforted me in sorrow. It has aroused me over and over from my complacency and privilege. It has made me slower to judge and made room for my own humanity and failings. Liberal religion, of which Unitarian Universalism is but one stripe, has been the altar where I could bring my own brokenness and be renewed. So like most of the first principle dissenters I've met, mine is a lover's quarrel, one which we're probably going to lose for the long term. And yet we can live with that because folks can live with us. We don't expect a new commission will be struck anytime soon, nor is it likely those fancy bookmarks listing the 7 principles will be altered to say, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the conditional worth and dignity of every person. Ain't going to happen. But let me end on a fairly somber note. It's telling that in the back of our gray, most recent hymn book, you will find no heading between evening and evolution. So like I said, friends, these are deep waters. Thank you much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.
Let us bring this time to a close with this benediction from our interim minister, Don. We were never meant to think one thought. We were never meant to proclaim one truth. We're here to be better, wiser, and stronger than we ever imagined. We're here to find and follow the paths only we can trod. We're here to right wrongs and free minds. We're here to bind up wounds. We go forth grateful for the love that transcends our differences. We go forth assured that love will make room for us. Go in peace, and don't forget to vote.